So good evening, doctors. Welcome to our 17th session of recalls-based discussion. Here we have a list of topics which we are going to cover today, and mostly we are going to cover from AMBUS because very less description is there in MTB. So first topic, cerebral palsy. Let me take you through AMBUS. So first topic we are going to deal here is cerebral palsy. So it's a heterogeneous group of disorders affecting the muscle tone and the development of movement and posture. So you are going to see in whenever the child is presenting with CP, or you can say a CP child, it has a heterogeneous group of disorders. So most likely in our MCQ based discussion for our recalls point of view, you usually have the questions where you will see the symptoms of a child who is going to present, especially with some kind of symptoms which are very particular about cerebral palsy, and you are going to diagnose that child. And there are some particular etiologies which are very concerned with cerebral palsy. So we'll look for all these things right now. So here we will see there is a muscle tone and development of movement and posture. So overall, the baby is presenting to you who is having some movement problem, gait posture problems, the muscle tone is disturbed, and CP result from a non-progressive damage to the brain in utero or during infantile development up to the age of 3 years. Mostly, well, as a, I have this gynae experience, so I have some, thing which I have seen in my experience, that whenever during delivery time period you have seen bradycardia for so long period of time. It's okay, sometimes with the type 1 D cells we usually see bradycardia, like the heartbeat of the baby dropped as soon as, whenever there is something with, like around the neck, that is umbilical cord, one loop or two loop, three loops around the umbilical cord. Those babies usually show type 1 D cells, like their heart rate goes down whenever there is a contraction, whenever the uterus is contracted, because of the tightening of the umbilical cord which is around the neck, the baby's heart rate is actually going down. So sometimes we can see bradycardia pattern like this, sometimes we can see type 1 T cells like that. But if you regularly see on a pattern of CTG that the heart rate is going below 120 beats per minute, so that is very alarming, that the baby's heart rate should not go beyond below 120 beats per minute. Otherwise, if there is persistent bradycardia, and if it will go for so long, that child may ended up in having this CP, cerebral palsy. That's very important. And sometimes when there is a sudden bradycardia, like heartbeat goes up to 50 beats per minute or 60 beats per minute, that is sometimes also happening. That's a severe bradycardia. So that severe bradycardia should not continue beyond 2 minutes. If it continues beyond 2 minutes, you can think about CP child. That is really, really important whenever we are conducting a delivery. Even sometimes during normal delivery, when we are applying this vacuum and the maternal push is not there, we usually have this CP child during vacuum deliveries and during forceps deliveries. But in fact, during forceps delivery, we have the power of forceps. We usually go and get over that problem. But during vacuum, when maternal push is not there, and sometimes the cup is not working, sometimes suddenly the pressure of the vacuum goes down. So these are some common, complications which may occur and can cause a CP child. So think about, not only in the delivery point of view, not only at the time of delivery, at the time of when the mother is fully dilated and about to deliver, it may occur any time of the birth till 3 years of age. So it's not like that only in the uterine, only in the uterus during the time of delivery, it's only the happening, but maybe sometime after delivery, up to 3 years of age, that this infant can develop the CP condition. So depending on the affected brain area, spastic, ataxic, or dyskinetic cerebral palsy develops. So we have certain types of cerebral palsies in which maybe we can see some spastic movement, maybe we can see some kind of ataxia, like posture, gait disturbances. We can see some disproportional movement, dyskinetic cerebral palsy. So all the terms, when we are using a spastic term, what do we mean by that? A physical finding of increase involuntary velocity. So you can see some involuntary movement, that is called spasm, spastic movement. Then ataxic means that a lack of coordination of voluntary movements. So there, in case of a spastic, you were having some involuntary movements. Involuntary movements means that the movement which are not controlled under your, like you cannot control, a baby cannot control his movement. But if the voluntary movements, are there, but that are not coordinated one, we can say this is the ataxic type of cerebral palsy. And dyskinetic, of course, means that kinesia means movement. So there is somewhat difficulty in movement. So that term is called dyskinetic cerebral palsy. These are some typical types of cerebral palsy. Now, while in many cases there is no identifiable causes, risk factor can be prematurity. This is the one of the most important risk factors which you are going to remember for your exam point of view. Mostly the weight of the baby, the estimated fetal weight during delivery should be in between 3 to 4 kgs. That is considered to be an ideal weight. Some of the time, mostly children are 2.8 kgs. That is also acceptable. But those babies, think about those babies who are having the estimated fetal weight during delivery like 1 kg or 1.5 kg. Of course, these babies are severely premature babies. You can call them premature babies. So if birth weight is less than 1500 grams, like 1.5 kg, 1.5 kg or less than 1.5 kg are coming under the category of premature babies. So always, if the question says, what are the risk factors for developing cerebral palsy? So in that case, always think about prematurity of the baby is one of the main risk factor for having the CP child. Similarly, perinatal complications such as chorioamnitis, you remember whenever there is a leaking history in the mother, suddenly the water bag bursts. That is the premature rupture of membrane, maybe at 32 weeks or at 30 weeks or at 28 weeks. This is the time period which is not mature enough, and at that time, if the delivery happens, then of course there are chances of getting infection to the baby because of the damage to this amniotic membrane. These membranes rupture and they can introduce infection inside the baby, and that infection is called as chorioamnitis. So that is also one of the conditions that can predispose to cerebral palsy. Then we have this birth trauma. Of course, maybe any kind of instrumental deliveries can cause CP child, and intracerebral hemorrhage or postnatal infections such as meningitis. So maybe up to 3 years of age, of course, up to 3 years of age, there will be nothing related to prematurity, nothing related to chorioamnitis, nothing related to birth trauma, but maybe infectious thing. That is one of the most important infection you're going to memorize here is meningitis. So meningitis is the one in the child that can predispose to CP child. Now, the diagnosis of CP is usually not made before later in infancy when children fail to meet certain milestones. Inability to roll over or sit independently now is not made before or later in infancy when child fails to meet. It's not like that when the child is not actually following the milestones. Milestones means that like at 3 months of age, the child should do. And for your exam point of view, they usually ask these milestones questions. Say, for example, they usually ask like at what time the child is going to hold his neck. So that time period should be of 3 months. At what time he's going to sit up from lying position, that should be a 6-month child. Similarly, when he's going to stand up, so it is in between 9 months to 11 months. So these are the typical milestones in the children, which are actually very unique, and a normal child should acquire that milestone in that particular age pattern. So here we will see that we are not going to say, CP child on the basis whenever the child is showing delayed milestone. It's not like that. We have to look for the exact cause in order to make a diagnosis of CP. Now, physical indicators of spastic cerebral palsy include spastic paralysis of multiple limbs and joint contracture, scissor gait, and persistence of primitive reflexes. So here you can easily diagnose that these are some physical indicators. Say, for example, if I need to make a diagnosis of a spastic cerebral palsy, I need to see whether how the children is going to present, or what are the movement findings I can find in my children. Say, for example, if his gait is very much disturbed, he's walking improperly, he has some primitive reflexes, he's doing some involuntary or uncoordinated movements. So we can think about that which kind of cerebral palsy is there. As we have 3 cerebral palsies, if there is involuntary movement, we can say spastic one. If there is uncoordinated voluntary movements, we can say it's ataxic one. Or maybe there is some dysfunctioning or difficult movement structures, we can see difficult movement findings in a baby, we can say this one is dyskinetic cerebral palsy. So based on the presentation of the baby, we will decide which kind of CP child is having. Now, diagnosis is mainly based on the clinical picture, but cranial ultrasound or MRI can help identify the positive lesion. So exactly, you will make a diagnosis on the basis of whatever the symptoms are there, like the clinical presentation is very important, but we can go for the ultrasound. In fact, we can go for the MRI. That will be the most accurate test in order to see whether what kind of infection is there. Maybe there is some meningitis or brain infection is there, maybe hemorrhage history is there, maybe some kind of brain malformation is there. So we need to know exactly what causes there. Now, since there is no cure, management follows a multidisciplinary approach with a focus on treating contraction like bracing, antispasmodic physical therapy. So as such, there is no medicine. Like there is no medicine we can say exactly I can give this to a child and the child can show coordinated movement. It's not like that. You have to go for some supportive therapy, some physical exercises that you're going to offer to your children, or maybe if infection is there, beside if the cause is infectious one, you can treat the infection and maybe the child can become better. But of course, there is no particular cure, like on the basis of which we can say, okay, by doing this, our child will get better. No, it's not like that. It's only a supportive therapy. Now, ensuring social participation like speech therapy, and depending on the severity and type of cerebral palsy, patient may slightly restricted or severely disabled and unable to walk. Most of the time, if there is too much coordinated movement, of course, the child will be having too much difficulty in walking, and maybe despite of providing occupational therapy, physical therapy, the child will not be able to move, like a way like the other normal childs are moving. So let's have a look at what can be the infection here. The main etiologies we have already learned in the summary, that maybe prematurity is the one of the risk factor you are going to memorize. And then infection, these torch infections. You remember, whenever a mother is going for antenatal visit, the first antenatal visit, we have to go for this all torch infection screening protocol. Like we have to go for this rubella testing. We need to see this toxoplasmosis infection. We have to look for any varicella infection, cytomegalovirus infection history. We have to rule out all these infections especially in the mother, just in order to prevent these kind of CP things in a baby. So these torch infections are very important because they may cause, the cerebral palsy in this child, the child who is not born yet. So these are some important things. Then we'll go for how the baby is going to present. We have already covered this one. So if we could just particularly revise this one. All types of palsy, we are not considering about spastic or ataxic or dyskinetic. If we are considering any type of palsy, we will think about that patient do not reach certain milestones. Of course, milestones will be delayed, or maybe the child cannot even achieve that milestone. Say, for example, the walking cannot be there at 11 months of age at all. Intellectual disability, of course, 50% IQ power will be low in these children because brain is severely affected. Seizure disorder, because whenever think about brain, neurological disturbance, you can think about seizures problem in these babies, joint contractures, attention deficit hyperactivity disorder. These are the presentation which we can see in any type of cerebral palsy. But if you are more concerned about a spastic one, we will see there will be increased muscle tone, deep tendon reflexes will be much exaggerated. You can see persistence of primitive reflexes like Babinski's sign. That's a normal sign which should be, that should be completely gone by the time when the baby is like 3 months of age or 6 months of age. But if it continues, we can say it's a primitive reflexes that is actually continued. It should be removed by the time when the baby achieves certain milestone. But here, as the baby is not achieving milestone, we will see some primitive reflexes are going on. Similarly, hip dislocation, scoliosis, and maybe in the later life, we can see hearing or vision impairment. So this is the most important presentation. But whenever it says spastic type 1, so always think about involuntary movements, which we are going to see here, especially in these child and delayed milestones. Now, non-spastic type include all type, maybe ataxic type, maybe dyskinetic type. So here you will see abnormal involuntary movements. Here you will see chorea. Chorea means what? A type of involuntary movement characteristic of a group of neurological disorder called dyskinesias. This means difficult or dysfunctional. Kinesia means movement. So you are going to see one kind of involuntary movement where the movement is quite difficult or the movement is quite dysfunctional, that we can say it's a chorea. That's an abrupt movement, sudden, abrupt, involuntary movement. The baby has no control over that movement. Then athetosis. Athetosis, again, it's one of our involuntary movement of the fingers, hand, toes caused by damage to the thalamus. So it's a brain damage. Because of the brain damage, if certain involuntary movements are there in the periphery, we can term them athetosis. Dystonia, of course, as the words indicate, this means dysfunctional. So tone of the muscle is quite dysfunctional. Ataxia, again, it's one of a kind of voluntary movement, but there is lack of coordination of voluntary movement. That term is called ataxia. So you can find all of these things in any kind of palsy which is not related to spastic one, that may be related to taxic one, or that may be related to dyskinetic one. Now, how you're going to diagnose, we have already covered this one. We'll go for the, first of all, the diagnosis is usually clinical, but maybe we can go for ultrasound, and maybe we can go for MRI. So this, of course, for your MCQ point of view, they are not going to ask you this one because diagnosis is usually clinical. So they will give you symptoms, and on the basis of symptoms, you have to diagnose. Now for the treatment part, we have already covered this one. As such, there is no pharmacological treatment. We cannot say that this drug is going to cure cerebral palsy. It's not like that. The baby has to have received this one supportive care. You can provide some kind of physical exercises, this occupational therapy, the educational support, nutritional support, any kind of support, and plus, of course, supportive therapy. Like if seizures are there, you have to give anticonvulsants. If there are any problem related to infections, you have to give antibiotics, or maybe antivirus if the cause is this one virus one or bacterial one. And surgery, if there is scoliosis, of course, we'll go for the scoliosis surgery. So only supportive treatment is there. So now let's have a look at the question. Here the question says, a 9-month-old baby is brought to the Well Baby Clinic. So age of the child is very important. Here the baby is 9 months old. He is unable to sit. Now 9 months. Do you think the milestone is delayed? Of course the milestone is delayed. Sitting should be there. In a normal child at 6 months of age, the child should sit from lying position. He can do by himself sitting. But now the baby is 9 months old and still he is unable to sit. So one of the feature here is delayed milestone. And on examination, his hands are fisted and his legs are crossed. So his hands are fisted. You can see this tight movement of this hand, and legs are crossed. Of course, he like during the lying position also, his legs is not straight. Normally, the babies usually keep their legs straight, but this baby is actually crossed his legs, and while during lying position, and hands are in fisted position. His mother said that he did not cry after the birth and resuscitation. Now see, so soon after the delivery, the baby was not crying. So there's only one condition when the baby was not crying after birth, whenever he was in severe bradycardia. So that is the most important thing during Apgar score. We have to see that if the baby is not crying, it means that the baby's Apgar score was very low. The baby was in bradycardia. The baby must be having bradycardia during delivery time period. So these are some important symptoms which are pointing you towards making some diagnosis. So what do you think? So if the baby was having this delayed cry or no crying after birth, it means that severe bradycardia was there during delivery and the baby was unable to sit, so delayed milestones. And now the baby is showing some spastic things like legs crossed, fisted things during normal examination. So what comes in your mind? So which of the following is consistent with these findings? Do you think it's a normal child? Of course, he is not a normal child. CP child, Down syndrome, or congenital hypothyroidism. So Down syndrome, you cannot say like that. And for Down syndrome, of course, we have to have some other features also. Like the baby should be having this single palm crease, it's a syndromic baby. So you cannot say it's a Down syndrome baby. Congenital hypothyroidism, again, any of the symptom is not mimicked with the hypothyroidism. For hypothyroidism, there will be slow movement, lethargic child should be there. And of course, we have to have this TSH in order to make a diagnosis. But for CP child, you don't need anything to make a diagnosis. Just a clinical presentation is quite sufficient for you to make a diagnosis. Like in this child, he is having delayed symptoms. He was not crying or just soon after delivery. Delayed crying was there, or in fact no crying was there, and he's having some spastic movement during presentation. So it's a clear case of CP child.
Excuse me, Dr. Hira.
Yes, Dr. Pat.
Hypothyroid baby will be having normal development. Now he will be having constipation, abdominal distension,
yes, so some kind of these features related to GI features you can see, like the baby must be having constipated facies of the baby. You can see it's very, very low movement, low profile
but he will
baby.
be achieving his milestones.
Yeah, of course. Delayed milestones is only a problem related to nervous system. So hypothyroidism, the baby absolutely normal. There will be no delayed in milestones. Everything should be there in proper time period. Only the thing is that the baby's metabolic syndrome, because hypothyroid is a metabolic syndrome. So metabolism is quite slow. Because of that, you can see a slow lethargic baby. But anyhow, the milestones will be there. Yes, of course. Now for this one, here the question says, um, uh, again, this is a 9-month-old baby, is brought by his mother for assessment of feeding difficulties and constipation. Now, again, he is having some feeding difficulties and he is constipated. On examination, the baby's growth curve is below the 25th percentile, and there is a marked delay in his milestones. So, as soon as you have read the first line, assessment of feeding difficulties and constipation, of course, not about the feeding difficulties, but whenever it says constipation, we can think about congenital hyperthyroidism. But again, we have to see other symptoms as well. So feeding difficulties, we can think about some problem related to mouth, maybe something related to duodenal atresia, maybe something related to oral anatomy. So you can think about many things. But after reading the next part of the question, on examination, the baby's growth curve is below 25th percentile. So growth is quite disturbed, and there is marked delay in his milestones. So milestones are also very delayed. He had spastic tone all over. Now, this term is very clear and very suggestive that overall the spastic thing is there in the body. So think about whenever there is something related to delayed milestone and spastic tone is there. So you have to make a diagnosis of CP child. Now all over with crossed leg, but both arms were less spastic. So arms were less spastic. There is no much spasticity in the arm, but of course the legs were very crossed. So that will give you a clue that the periphery is quite affected as compared to the upper portion. So whenever something like this, so what we can say there, of course, that's a case of CP child, but in CP child, we have to see whether the lower limbs are involved much or upper limbs are involved or overall involvement is there. So in spasticity, we can see if only one limb is involved, so unilateral affected is there, or maybe diplegic, like both of the arms or both of the legs are involved, or maybe quadriplegic, in which all of the four things like 2 upper arms and 2 lower limbs are involved. We can say it's a quadriplegic. So in this child, what do you think? Here they are saying that of course cerebral palsy is there. So they are saying which of the following CP type is most likely to have. So this is a confirmed diagnosis of CP child. Now you have to classify, like this child is having less spasticity in upper hands, means upper hands spasticity is less, it's functional, but of course not up to the mark, but lower limbs are crossed. Legs are crossed. So it means that lower limbs are showing more spasticity as compared to the upper limb. So when 2 limbs are involved, we have to make a diagnosis of diplegic cerebral palsy. Diplegic spastic cerebral palsy. That should be the complete diagnosis. Why? Why we are not saying it's a quadriplegic? Because they are saying, it's clearly mentioned that his had spastic tone all over with cross leg, but both arms were less spastic. So of course, we have to make a diagnosis of diplegic. If it's mentioned all arms and the overall body is spastic, then we have to go for quadriplegic. Quadriplegic means all 4 things are involved, and diplegic means that only 2 are involved. So here lower limbs are affected more as compared to upper limbs. So we have to make a diagnosis of diplegic spastic cerebral palsy. This is diplegic.
Doctor, here why not mixed?
No, in mixed there should be 1 upper limb involved and at least 1 lower limb involved. So here it's clearly mentioned that both of means upper limb they have mentioned less spastic, and both of the lower legs are completely spastic. Both of them are crossed. If one is crossed,
one limb?
Huh?
In hemiplegic, one limb?
In hemiplegia, one side, like right arm and right lower limb, or maybe left arm and left lower limb. So that is one side of the body. So if one side of the body, that's called hemiplegia. If all 4, quadriplegia. If only upper limb or only lower limb, diplegia. Or mixed means 1 upper limb and 1 lower limb of any side.
Okay, thank you.
Now we will go to the question number 3. Here it's saying cerebral palsy is a non-progressive disorder of motion and posture. Which one of the following risk factors is the most significant? What do you think? So just recall cerebral palsy and let me know that what do you think, which of the following is the most significant risk factor? Do you think prematurity is the significant risk factor, or perinatal asphyxia, or you can say the birth weight less than 1.5 kg, or genetic metabolic causes? So what could be the most significant? See, prematurity of course is the one, but they are asking for the most. Perinatal asphyxia. Perinatal asphyxia means that starting from the before delivery till delivery and after delivery as well. So what do you think? It's only for perinatal? Do you think perinatal means before delivery till delivery? So it can occur up to 3 years of age. You cannot say it's a most significant one. But birth weight less than 1.5 kg is the one which covers the prematurity thing as well. So this is of course the obvious one, because for the prematurity we have to have a weight less than, but how much weight? So it should be less than 1.5 kgs. That is the most significant thing. Metabolic abnormalities, again, it's going to cover a syndrome, and we cannot say it's because in metabolic we don't have infections and all that, but here in the CP we have to have infections also. So first of all, premature baby, a very low size baby on birth, from infections and from metabolism, and then go again. So they are asking for the most significant. So remember in NAMPOS it was clearly mentioned those babies who are having weight less than 1500 gram or less than 1.5 kg, they are very prone, because these babies also will get infections after delivery. These babies also can have bradycardia during delivery as well. They cannot even bear a single pressure, a single kind, any kind of pressure. Even instrumental deliveries are very dangerous for these premature babies. Anyhow, we don't need to go for the forceps delivery, but anyhow bradycardia is there because of any reason. So a birth weight, if it's less than 1.5, that is considered to be the most significant. Anyhow, prematurity is also right, perinatal asphyxia is also right, but for perinatal asphyxia we also see that this can be happen up to 3 years of age. So we cannot make a diagnosis of perinatal, because postnatal we can also see prematurity, of course. Yes, dear.
Dr. Hira, actually,
Yes,
my daughter was born at 735 grams. So I was thinking it's perinatal asphyxia. Yeah, she was preemie, 28 weeks.
Okay. And how she's doing now?
She is, alhamdulillah, she is fine in all the milestones.
Mashallah, alhamdulillah. So that's very great. But she has
born
undergone
with
some kind of
7.5.
735 grams.
She's 735 grams.
That's great. So only prematurity is there, but she must have cried before delivery, and every APGAR score must be good.
Yeah, the score was good.
Yeah, that's a blessing, because if the APGAR score is low.
28 weeks.
28 weeks.
At what? 28 week?
28.
And her weight was
735 grams. She's saying 735 gram means not 1 kg, less than 1 kg.
730 means 750 grams.
35 grams, yeah. So alhamdulillah, her APGAR was good. So that's why.
So where was she taken care of? In Pakistan or here?
She was an NICU baby.
No, where?
Aga Khan, Karachi.
Oh, okay.
How long she been in the NICU?
1.5 months.
Okay, mashallah. She's
so
mashallah.
That's why everything is perinatal asphyxia, but low birth.
She's absolutely normal.
Yeah, she is fine, alhamdulillah. She's normal.
Mashallah. It's really very rare and very lucky for you.
Very lucky, yeah. Because I have never seen, 28 weeks survived. I've never. 30 weeks are a lot, but 28.
Imagine a premature child with such a low birth weight, immature heart, lung, kidneys, brain.
Developed apnea of prematurity. She was, alhamdulillah, fine with this scenario as well.
Infections
She's born with her 28 weekers. Many of them had this problem, but she didn't have such problem.
Yeah. Even underdeveloped eyes and ears and everything.
She suffered retinopathy of prematurity. We got a treatment for that as well.
Oh,
okay.
We just move forward.
Yeah.
This scary discussion.
Yeah.
Even unable to feed, how they were feeding her by IV?
It was parental total, and then after NICU, it was on OG.
Yeah.
OG. Okay. Till how long you fed her on NG-tube?
Okay, I actually don't remember exactly. It's 3 months after the NICU.
Okay. Mashallah. Alhamdulillah.
Okay. So for this case, what we have to choose here? So think about most significant one. You have to go for birth weight less than 1.5. It is clear in APGAR, right? We'll not go for prematurity. We know prematurity, but it has to be less than 1.5. Okay. So for the next one, we have to go for the theory first. Let me see. Next, we have Erb's palsy. So for this one, again, we have to go for the AMBUS. Okay, so this ERP palsy, again, it's one of the complication mostly during the delivery, or maybe any kind after delivery, or any time period during the whole life. Whenever there is the upper trunk damage to the brachial plexus, and especially two nerves which are coming from the level of C5 and C6, cervical 5 and cervical 6 vertebra. So if these C5 and C6 nerves are damaged, which mostly occur during delivery, but maybe sometime later in life because of any reason, then you can think about that it can result to ERP palsy. Now, what will be there, or why? What are the main reasons for having this damage to C5 and C6? There is excessive lateral flexion of the neck. If there is too much flexion of the neck, think about during the delivery. If it's there, maybe because of trauma, that will be a most important one. Say, for example, motor vehicle accident, road traffic accident, the patient can have this injury to C5 and C6, or maybe birth injury, which are very most common one, excessive lateral traction of the neck during delivery, and shoulder dystocia is there. So there may be any reason. If there is damage to the C5 and C6, which mostly occurring during birth, or maybe any kind of motor vehicle or road traffic accident or trauma history, that can lead to ERP palsy. Now, the important thing, how your patient is going to present. First of all, weakness of muscle in C5 and C6 myotomes, flexed wrist with an extended forearm and internally rotated and adducted arm. That is called waiter stiff posture. That is a very important point. Whenever you have seen any person who is having the hand something like this, like his wrist is flexed with an extended forearm. Forearm must be extended. Just think about that the waiter is receiving a tip. How is receiving a tip? He is receiving a tip very silently, and his hand must be straight and back towards his back. So that's a typical position of waiter's tip. So just think about that position of the waiter's tip. He's receiving a tip, and think about the person who's having this ERP palsy having the same posture. Her forearm or his forearm must be straight, and wrist must be flat and internally rotated and towards the body. Adducted means that towards the body, and abducted means away from the body. So internally rotated means hand will go internally rotated, and behind the back you can see his or her hand. So that's a typical position, waiter stiff posture. Here, weak bicep brachii, brachialis, brachioradialis. Of course, C5 is usually providing the nerve innervations to the upper limb muscles. So what are the muscles of upper limb? Brachialis, brachioradialis, biceps brachii. These are the major muscles. So we will see weakness of these muscles because nerve supply is damaged for these muscles. Impaired flexion and supination of the forearm, because supination is the phenomenon of biceps muscle. So whatever the movement biceps muscles are doing, or the major muscles of the upper limb are doing, that function will be lost here. Weak infraspinatus and supraspinatus, they are the main external rotators. So of course, that's why the arm is internally rotated, because external rotators are impaired here. Weak deltoid and supraspinate. Deltoid is also one of the main abductor of arm. That's why the abduction is also lost here. So think about the upper limb muscles, their functions, and because the nerve supply is damaged to those muscles, so function of those muscles will be impaired. Now, how we are going to treat these patients? Immobilization in flexion, external rotation, and with an abduction braces, we will go for the thing which is not occurring here. Say, for example, there is too much adduction, we'll go for abduction exercises. There is too much internal rotation, we'll try to go for the external rotation exercises. We'll provide physiotherapy. Or maybe if there is too much damage, or if nerve is if there is too much damage, we can go for the surgical resection of that area. Maybe sometimes nerve is not properly damaged and there is some paresthesia of that muscle. We have to cut that nerve, or we have to cut the supply of that muscle just in order to relieve that muscle from paresthesia effect. Like nerve is not properly damaged and nerve is not actually properly responsible for the muscle contraction, then that area should be resected. So let's have a look at the question related to this one. Here its question says, a full-term baby born to a diabetic mother, full-term baby, diabetic mother. Whenever it says diabetic mother or gestational diabetes, we will always think about macrosomic babies, because usually the babies born to these mothers are having good size. It's not like that they must be having a good size. It's a general thought. It's a general thought that whenever the mother is diabetic, maybe she is a known diabetes, or maybe she's a gestational diabetes. They usually have macrosomic babies. They usually have good size babies, and whenever they have good size babies, we have complications also in our mind that maybe this baby during delivery must have undergone shoulder dystocia. That's a common presentation. Those babies whose weight is more than 4 kgs, they usually stuck, their anterior shoulder usually stuck behind the beneath the pubis. So that is the major complication called shoulder dystocia. So here it's saying is brought to the clinic for assessment. The baby born by vaginal delivery. The Moro reflex is absent on the right side, and baby weight is 4.8 kilogram. Can you think about this one? 4.8. It's a too much size, good size baby. The good sized baby, and Moro's reflex is lost. Moro's reflex is actually the reflex occurring from the cervical plexus. Cervical plexus are the one which are responsible for Moro's reflexes, and that's a very primitive reflex of the baby. If this reflex is absent here, and the good sized baby is there, and so what do you think? What you will think about this one? Do you think it's a case of intracranial hemorrhage? There is nothing related to the hemorrhage here. If there is hemorrhage or something history is there, then what will happen? There will be some very dysplastic or dystonic movements are there. As far as the upper limbs are concerned and the lower limbs are concerned, overall motor disturbance is there if any kind of intracranial hemorrhage is there. Neonatal hypoglycemia, there is, of course, hypoglycemia can be there in that baby, because these babies who are actually a mother of infant of diabetic mother, they are usually, when they born, they have to have IV, we have to give them 10% dextrose, because soon after delivery, a mother should take at least half an hour to feed the baby, right? But these babies cannot even wait for half an hour, because their insulin level inside the maternal blood is too much high that they are very hypoglycemic. So they can go into hypoglycemic shock. So we have to feed those babies through IVs. We have to give them 10% dextrose, or maybe you can give them orally dextrose, just in order to prevent hypoglycemia of especially these child who are called infant of diabetic mother. So neonatal hypoglycemia can be there, but neonatal hypoglycemia has nothing to do with this absent Moro reflex. So we will have to think about something else. Then neonatal sepsis, there is no signs of sepsis. For sepsis, there must be fever. For sepsis, there must be tachycardia. There is nothing related here. Only they are saying good sized baby, and only they are saying Moro's reflex, and the vaginal delivery history is there. It means that something has happened. That's why Moro reflex was absent, and he is a good sized baby. So we will always think about shoulder distortion. We always think about palsy here, also palsy. Why? Because that's the main common palsy occurring during birth, especially that's called birth injury, especially those who have undergone shoulder dystocia problem, or those who are actually infant of diabetic mothers. So of course, that's which of the following is the most likely cause? We are not saying it's a Erb's palsy. We have to go for the checking of the C5 and C6. But of course, based on the presentation, we can think about Erb's palsy, and what are the bases? Infant of diabetic mother, macrosomia, 4.8 kg baby on delivery, too much good size baby, vaginal delivery, we can think of shoulder dystocia, and Moro's reflex absent, that's a major brachial reflex, which is caused by C5 and C6. So if this is absent, so think about there is something damage to C5 and C6, and damage to C5 and C5 is actually called Erb's palsy. So that's a clear diagnosis.
Doctor, can you revise Moro reflex? Just not.
Yeah. So Moro reflex. See, sometimes when once you just hold the baby in your hand and you just suddenly drop the baby. So what will happen? All the four arms, like upper arms and lower arms, they used to extend those arms. Like when you hold the baby and you suddenly drop him. Don't hold it completely in your hand, just lift the baby up and just drop the baby. So what will happen? The baby will show all the extensions of four limbs, like upper limbs will be extended and lower limbs will be extended. But if the Moro's reflex is absent, then what will happen? The baby will not show any kind of movement. There will be no extension of the arms and no extension of the limbs at all. So that will give you a clue why the baby's arm is not extended, why it's keep on abducting, why the arms are there on the side of the baby's body, why the arms are not extended, why the arms are not abducted. There must be something happened, that's why this Moro's reflex is absent, because in 100% normal case baby, the Moro's reflex is the basic thing, and it should be there up to 3 months. It's a very, very important basic neonatal reflex. So if this reflex is not there, extension is not there upon dropping a baby, so it means that something has wrong with the upper limbs. And once we are thinking about wrong with the upper limbs, we have to always think about damage to the nerves of the upper limbs, and mostly C5 and C6, which is responsible for Moro's reflex.
Okay, thank you very much.
Okay, for the next one, we have to go for the theory first. Next, we have to cover this acute cerebral ataxia. Acute cerebral ataxia is even not much in detail in AMBERS. So I have to take you to one of the site for this one. We have here, we are going to cover from here this acute cerebral ataxia. Ataxia, you know very well, it's a lack of coordinated voluntary movements. But whenever we say cerebellum is involved, that's the main thing when we are covering, especially this one that which is especially related to posture, related to balance. So here we are saying this one, uncoordinated muscle movement due to disease or injury to the cerebellum. Cerebellum is the one which is the main thing of the brain, who is actually maintaining your whole equilibrium of the body, your whole balance of the body. So whenever there is any injury to that cerebellum, or whenever there is any disease condition to that cerebellum, going to be lost. And this is the area in the brain that controls muscle movement. So ataxia means loss of muscle coordination, especially of the hands and legs. So why we are saying hands and legs? Because hands and legs muscles are voluntary muscles. They are not involuntary. And whenever we say voluntary muscles, we will always think about skeletal muscles, because skeletal muscles are purely voluntary. Smooth muscles are purely involuntary muscles. So here we are considering all these, especially voluntary muscles and the lack of coordination between those muscles. And think about whenever we say acute cerebellar ataxia, it means that something goes wrong inside the cerebellum, maybe an injury, maybe an infection, maybe a tumor, anything. So maybe an abscess, maybe an infection, maybe bleeding, maybe ischemia, maybe stroke, maybe any kind of thing, maybe trauma can be there that can lead to this one. And sometimes there are some certain bacterial and viral infections also that can lead to infection of the cerebellum and can lead to ataxia, but that will be for a very shorter period of time. Once that infection is over, that condition will be over. Say for example, you can see mostly after the infection of chicken pox. Usually every child has got this infection early in the ages of life. So we usually see after the chicken pox infection, maybe after 1 week and 2 weeks, suddenly the baby is presenting with certain uncoordinated and lack of coordinated voluntary movement, like hands movement are not proper, the baby is not properly walking, he is lagging, the gait is lagging, the posture is lagging. So we can say it's a cerebellar ataxia. I want to show you one video also, but let's finish this one. So mostly the child is going to present with clumsy speech pattern and clumsy gait also. Means dysarthria. There is no proper saying. You cannot understand. The baby must be mumbling. You cannot understand whatever the baby is saying. So that's called clumsy speech, clumsy gait. The baby is walking, but the walking is very uncoordinated. You have to hold the hand of the baby all the time during walking. There may be some eye problem, nystagmus can be there, uncoordinated eye movements can be there, walking problems, of course, that leads to falls. So these babies are very prone towards fall. Of course, they are going to fall every time, and someone has to hold their hands every time whenever they are walking. So of course, we can go for testing, and that can be CT scan, MRI scan, because we need to see what is actually happening in the cerebellum. So what is the cause? Infection is the cause, tumor is the cause, injury is the cause, maybe abscess is the cause. Whatever the cause is there, we have to rule out that one. So treatment will all depend what is actually the symptoms are there. So say for example, if any bleeding or something abscess is there, we have to drain that, we have to give antibiotic for that. If there is any infection, we have to treat that. Maybe sometime if there is too much inflammation, we have to give corticosteroid, which will act like a magic and subside the inflammation. Or maybe if there is a viral infection, say for example like chickenpox infection. So of course during viral infection, we usually don't give anything. Viral infections are usually self-limited and self-resolving. So with the passage of time, that will be self-resolve, or if it's very aggressive, we can go for antivirals as well. So that is the one. So I would just wanted to show you one video so that you can see how the baby who's having cerebral ataxia is presenting to you. See this baby, if you can see. So closely look the baby. She is not walking properly actually. And she is a case where she has committed this chickenpox infection after this one. She has undergone this one. So now let's have a look at the question. A 6-year-old child is brought to the clinic with sudden onset of a clumsy gait So clumsy gait is there. You can always think about cerebellar something, and inability to stand or walk without support. Now she's not 6-year-old child if she's not walking her alone. So that's a very alarming situation. Now, the child is irritable and has been vomiting over the last 3 days and had chickenpox 3 weeks before. So still she's having, this child is having vomiting, and she was having a history of chickenpox as well. So viral infection, preceding viral infection is there. Muscle strength testing does not reveal any abnormality. So there is no kind of muscle disorder is there, but there is a resistance to neck flexion. So there is resistance to neck flexion, and right now she's vomiting. History of chickenpox also. So if there is resistance to neck flexion, maybe still there is something related to the infectious thing is here, because she is able to resist that neck flexion. Maybe you can think about, I'm not saying it's meningitis or something like that, but you can always think about, you have to always rule out all of these infections that can lead to neck flexion, resistance to neck flexion. Now, which of the following disorder is most likely present? What do you think? What kind of disorder can be there? Whether it's a Friedreich ataxia, or it's a meningoencephalitis, or acute cerebellar ataxia, or maybe it's a Guillain-Barré syndrome. So for this Friedreich ataxia, that's again one of the kind of the ataxia. But here mostly involuntary muscle involvement is there. But we know very well, if the child is not walking properly, that's a purely voluntary act, voluntary muscles involvement. There's a lack of coordination between the voluntary muscles that can cause cerebellar ataxia. But for this one, Friedreich, that can involve involuntary also. So of course, this is not the diagnosis. Meningoencephalitis, if meningoencephalitis is there, we cannot say meningoencephalitis, because for that we have to have CSF findings and all that in order to make a diagnosis of this one. And of course, there will be inflammatory condition in the body. You will see raised ESR. You have to have CSF result with you. You will see this, especially bacterial causes their high predominance neutrophil count, but that is nothing over here. And she has already a chickenpox viral infection, so we cannot think about this one. Acute cerebellar ataxia is the one which we are likely going to say, because why? The baby is having clumsy gait. So that is again one of the findings. The baby is having, without support, the baby cannot move, and she's not that much old. She's 6 years old. So if 6 years old is having clumsy gait, that must be related to cerebellum. So, and what is cerebellum? And preceding chickenpox history is there. So most likely a viral infection is there, which is actually responsible for these, intermittent acute cerebellar ataxia. But with the passage of time, this baby, of course, will get better, because once the infection is completely resolved, the baby will regain its normal position. And this one, it's actually upper motor neuron disease, GBS. So of course, GBS is not the diagnosis. So here, on the basis of symptoms, we'll go for ataxia. Okay, for the next one, we have to go for the theory first.
Friedreich's ataxia, doctor. Friedreich's ataxia.
Yeah, Friedreich's ataxia is one of the ataxia where you see usually the involvement of involuntary muscles. So here, especially the voluntary muscles are involved, because the gait problem is there. This is not working properly. So that's the purely lower limb involvement. Lower limb is not functionally working, or there is lack of coordination between the lower limb muscles. So that's purely a voluntary involvement. We cannot say Friedreich ataxia, because in Friedreich ataxia,
involuntary muscles.
That involuntary muscles are usually smooth muscles, like organ muscles. Those are forming the cirrhosis
but
of the
how
muscles.
we can see them clinically?
Yeah, because sometimes we have this gastric motility problem, gastroparesis is there. So you always think about smooth muscle of the small intestine. So there will be no striations, there will be no peristalsis.
But we cannot appreciate clinically.
Yeah, clinically, of course, that's very difficult.
This is not a good option given here. This is not
But because it's one of the type of incoordinated movement, that's why it's mentioned here. Maybe. We cannot say why it's mentioned here, but of course. So you have to think about that, what could be the result here. So of course, involuntary have to rule out. Voluntary is the main reason. Infectious cannot be there based, because you have to have CSF diagnosis with you in order to make a diagnosis of meningoencephalitis. And GBS is an autoimmune upper motor neuron disease. That's totally different scenario. So we'll go with the ataxia. Okay, for this one, we have to go for the theory first. So now we are covering this amblyopia. Amblyopia, again, we are going to cover from AMBUS. Okay, So this amblyopia, actually, it's one of the complication of strabismus, and so you have to know especially about strabismus, and then only you can cover the complication of strabismus. So strabismus, if we think, I'm just going to show you here. It's in which the degree of the deviation remains constant in all direction of gaze. So it's one of the eye misalignment of an eye with regard to the normal visual axis. So whatever the normal visual axis is there, if you can appreciate that the eye is actually showing misalignment, eye is misaligned with the normal axis, you can say that's a strabismus. And if there is misalignment, we have to always go for cover testing. We have to cover one eye and we have to see the movement on the other eye. So if the other eye is moving laterally, you can say the cover test is positive, and that's the most initial test which we usually go for checking strabismus or for checking amblyopia. What we are actually doing, we have to cover one eye and we have to see the movement on the other eye, the other eye which we are actually testing, which is not covered. And if you see, just by hiding, just by covering the one eye, if the other eye moves, suddenly you can see the other eye is moving laterally. So that is showing strabismus. That is showing the misalignment. And what is the main result of this misalignment? The main result is the eye is not able to focus properly. Our both of the eyes are responsible to form one image, but in this strabismus condition or amblyopia condition, what we usually see, that image in the brain is actually forming from one eye. The other eye is not responsible to form an image. And you know what is happening with the passage of time? If this continues, that one side of the brain is become non-functional, one part of the cerebral hemisphere has become non-functional, or with the passage of time it's showing no function at all, that area is going to be necrosed. That will be no more active. Why? Because there is no functioning over there. The eye is not receiving impulse from that side, and that side, well, you remember we have we must have read this one in during evolution, that those animals who actually don't use their organs, with the passage of time their organs are vestigial, and in the next generation they completely wiped off. Say for example, the giraffes were having long neck before, and with the passage of time, when there is grassland, there are no more high trees, then what will happen? The necks are actually getting shorter and shorter, and now we are having not very much high necked giraffe. Similarly, snakes have to have lower limbs and upper limbs, but with the passage of time they have to hide themselves, because in order to protect them from enemies, and they're not using their hands and feet, that's why their hands and feet are resolved. So this is all about evolution. Similarly, in the brain also happen. If one eye is only forming image and the other eye is not taking impulse at all, then what will happen? That part of the cerebral hemisphere is getting weaker and weaker and non-functional, and with the passage of time it will get necrosed and ischemic, and it will become completely non-functional. So that is one of the major complication of this amblyopia. So if we just go back to the amblyopia. So here, amblyopia is a visual decrease in one or both eyes, functional visual impairment. Like with the passage of time, if we see, if there is continuous misalignment in one eye because of this strabismus, what will happen? There will be one complete dysfunctional site in the brain due to the developmental vision disorder during early childhood. So pathophysiology, one or both eyes cover poor or mismatched visual information to the brain, like the information is not going into the brain properly, and brain suppresses information from one or both eye. Disuse of the eye, disuse of the eye, that eye is not actually functioning, and lacking visual stimuli with partial undevelopment of the visual cortex. That visual cortex will become underdeveloped. There will be underdevelopment of that visual cortex, and with the passage of time, that visual cortex will not become active. That will be completely inactive, and that is one of the most serious complication of this misalignment of eyes. So that is very, very important. This amblyopia is one of the most severe complication of this child. This child has to be corrected. His visual impairment should be corrected up to 2 years of age. It should not go beyond that. Otherwise, what will happen? There will be misuse of the eye, and after some time, the brain will not function, and what will happen? There will be complete dysfunction of that particular area. So let's have a look at the questions here. A 4-year-old child is brought to a clinic for a checkup. When performing the cover test, the child's left eye moves laterally when the right eye is covered. That's a simple cover test just to check the alignment of the eye. So we have already covered this one. If you cover one eye and the other eye is going on the lateral side, it means that there is misalignment. There is strabismus. So strabismus will be confirmed with the basis of this cover testing. What we are actually checking in cover testing? We are checking the alignment of the eye. So if by covering the one eye, the other eye is going on the lateral side, it means that that eye is having misalignment. And if this misalignment is present, we can say it's a positive strabismus sign. So if there is strabismus, we always have to always consider for this important pathology, that is amblyopia. Not pathology, we should say important complication, that is amblyopia. Now the question is asking which of the following is the most serious complication. See, whenever you are solving MCQs, you have to read twice or thrice just in order to see what exactly examiner is wanting to ask you. What examiner is really want to ask you. Whether he is asking you to make a diagnosis of this one, or he is asking you to just imagine a diagnosis and now think about the complication of that diagnosis. Here, the question is not asking you what is the diagnosis. See, which of the following is the most serious complication. Now, on the basis of symptoms, you have to decide your one of the diagnosis, right? And that diagnosis you will keep in your mind, and then you will decide the complication of that diagnosis and whether you can see any kind of complication listed down in the answer choices. If there is that one, you have to choose that one. So here the question is asking which of the following is the most serious complication. They are not asking you about the diagnosis. They are asking you whatever the diagnosis is there. Now you have to think about the complication of that diagnosis. So diagnosis here, it's clear strabismus. Why? Because whenever the positive cover test is there, that will clear the diagnosis of strabismus, because strabismus means that misalignment. And when we do the cover testing, we cover one eye, the other eye moves laterally. It means that positive cover test, and positive cover test means that the baby is having strabismus. Now the diagnosis is clear. In our mind, that's strabismus. Now think about the complication of strabismus. So we have already learned this one, that one of the most serious complication of strabismus is amblyopia. So strabismus, we cannot choose this one. Why? Because strabismus is a diagnosis, it's not the complication itself. So it's a diagnosis, we cannot choose this one. Nystagmus is a diagnosis, not a complication of anything. Amblyopia and leukocoria are the two complications. Leukocoria means white reflex. Do you think the white reflex is the most lethal one or the most significant complication? Of course not. This amblyopia is the one. Why? Because if we are not going to correct the amblyopia, then this child visual cortex is going to be non-functional for whole life. So we have to treat amblyopia. This is one of the complication of strabismus. Are you getting my point? This question is very tricky. They are not
So,
asking.
Dr. Hira,
Yeah.
so strabismus is the diagnosis and amblyopia is
Yeah. Complication of strabismus. Yes,
No,
that's
strabismus means the eye is
misaligned.
separate sides. And amblyopia means the brain is not developing, that side of brain will not develop.
Yeah, so that means amblyopia is one of the complication of strabismus. Are you getting my point? It's one of the complication of strabismus. If strabismus goes on, amblyopia will be more and more and more. So we have to treat amblyopia. So if they are asking most serious complication, they are not asking you what is the diagnosis. If they are asking what is the diagnosis, go for strabismus. Because this whole symptoms is showing the baby is having strabismus. But they are asking which of the following is the most serious complication. So serious complication of strabismus is amblyopia. Got the point?
Yes.
So for the next one, we have to go for the theory first. Then we have this GBS for So amblyopia we have got now GPS. So GBS, you can say there are two pronunciation. One is Guillain-Barré syndrome. They are mostly British people are saying like this one, but we usually say Guillain-Barré syndrome or Guillain-Barré syndrome. So whatever the pronunciation you go for, if you go for the British physician, you can say Guillain-Barré syndrome. If you go for American physician, you will say Guillain-Barré syndrome. Whatever. So GBS is better to say, whether to say Guillain or Guillain. Okay, so let me take you to MTB. It's there. It's good in MTB. So in Guillain-Barré syndrome, it's an autoimmune damage of multiple peripheral nerves. So again, it's one of the autoimmune condition. We will see multiple peripheral nerves are involved. What are the peripheral nerves which are going to supply the periphery of the muscles? So any kind of voluntary muscles are there, or maybe involuntary muscles. Those are away from the body. We call them peripheral nerves, or spinal nerves are actually called peripheral nerves. So think about, there is an autoimmune damage to these nerves, and by definition, there is no CNS involvement, because once we say central nervous system, we are actually saying brain and spinal cord. But once we are saying cranial nerves and we are saying spinal nerves, we are saying actually peripheral nervous system. So nervous system is divided into two categories: central nervous system, which include brain and the spinal cord, and the peripheral nervous system, which include the nerves which are coming from the brain called cranial nerves, and the nerves which are coming from the vertebral column called spinal nerves. So that's a peripheral nervous system. So by definition, in this GBS, we don't have any kind of CNS involvement. A circulating antibody attacks the myelin. Of course, once we say it's an autoimmune disorder, we have to always think about there is always antigen-antibody reaction. In autoimmune, there is always antigen-antibody reaction. So here, antibody attacks the myelin sheet of the peripheral nerves. Whenever we say myelin sheet of the peripheral nerves, we have to think about that myelin sheet is actually formed by oligodendrocyte cells. Oligodendrocyte cells are the cells which are actually responsible in forming of this myelin sheet in central nervous system. But these oligodendrocyte cells are responsible to demyelinate the neurons in peripheral nervous system. So Schwann cells in the peripheral nervous system are responsible in making myelin sheet. So that is also one of the recall. In the previous in the previous files, you can see the recalls where they're asking you which of the following cells are responsible in forming the myelin sheet in peripheral nervous system. So you will always say, what happened, Dr. Taira? You cannot hear me? Dr. Taira, can you hear me? I think I have received calls, WhatsApp calls. Am I audible? Anyone can say anything so that I can see if my mic is working or not?
Yes, doctor.
Okay. Okay. Thank you. So, see, here we will, so there's a very common recall where they're asking which of the following cell is responsible for the formation of myelin sheet in peripheral nervous system. So in peripheral nervous system, Schwann cells are the one which actually form myelin sheet. But oligodendrocyte cells are the one in the brains which are responsible for the formation of myelin sheet. While these oligodendrocyte in the periphery are the one who is going to eat myelin sheet. Like they can destroy Schwann cells and they can damage the myelin sheet. So just memorize this point because that's an important recall. This oligodendrocyte in the brain, they form the myelin sheet, and this Schwann cells in the peripheral nervous system, they are responsible to form the myelin sheet. Now coming back to this one, here the antibodies in the GBS syndrome, they are actually going to attack on this myelin sheet and removing their insulation. So GBS is associated with Campylobacter jejuni infection. So most of the time the infections is there, but can't see. 1 minute.
Dr. Hira, I was not able to see. That was I was calling you.
Okay. Now can you see?
Yeah, I went back to the launch, the meeting, and from there, you were
Okay.
there, but I could not see you.
Okay. So, but it's okay now, right? We should continue.
Yes, just continue.
Okay. So here, just think about in GBS, what is happening? There must be a history of infection, and most of the time, the infection is responsible for Campylobacter jejuni infection. And what disinfection is going to do? In this, we will see the antibodies are going to form against this infection, and those antibodies are actually going to act on the peripheral nerves, and they will destroy the myelin sheet. And we know very well the function of myelin sheet. The function of myelin sheet is to do the saltatory conduction. Like the conduction is very fast whenever the neuron is myelinated. If the neuron is non-myelinated or unmyelinated, so that neurons are actually don't have so much nerve conduction velocity. So nerve conduction velocity will be very high in myelinated neurons. So here there is a disorder because of the infection. The antibodies are formed in the body, and those antibodies are not only going to work against the infection, but also going to work against our myelin sheet of the peripheral nerves, and they will remove the myelin sheet or eat the myelin sheet, and then what will happen? There will be a nerve conduction problem in the peripheral nerves of the body. So that is actually the GBS syndrome. Now, what is the most likely diagnosis? Look for the weakness in the legs that ascend from the feet and move towards the chest. So always you will see there will be a loss of deep tendon reflexes starting from the lower limb. First, lower limb will be involved, and slowly the patient will give you a history that first I was having weakness in my lower limb, and now it's started to the chest, and now it's coming on the upper side, upper body. So first of all, always in history, the patient is going to tell you about the weakness of the lower part of the body, and then slowly the weakness is going up. So see, if the weakness is going towards the chest, then what will happen? Respiratory movement can also be affected seriously. And autonomic dysfunction with hypertension, tachycardia can occur. So of course, when respiratory muscles are involved, upper limb muscles are involved, there can be some autonomic dysfunction you can see in your patient. So the patient may present with hypertension or tachycardic symptoms as well because of the involvement of the respiratory muscles. So that can also be a symptomatic clue for us. So whenever it says ascending weakness and loss of deep tendon reflexes, always think about GPS. Ascending weakness means first of all lower limb is involved, and then slowly the upper part of the body is going to get weaker and weaker. So always think about GPS. How we are going to diagnose these patients? The most specific diagnostic test is nerve conduction studies, of course, nerve conduction studies, or you can say electromyography, because the myelin sheath is damaged here, right? So we can go for nerve conduction testing. And these will show decrease, of course, in propagation of nerves that you can see easily. And CSF shows increased protein with the normal cell count. So increased protein, why? If Campylobacter jejunal infection is there, of course, protein content will be high, and most of the time you can also see the high neutrophil predominance count. But some of the time you can only see high protein involvement, high increased protein, and that is all because of infection, recent infection of Campylobacter jejunal. So they are saying what are the tests of the respiratory muscle involvement, how we will see the respiratory muscles are involved. If diaphragm is involved, diaphragm is the main inspiratory muscle. The whole inspiration depends on diaphragm. So there is a decrease in forced vital capacity and peak respiratory pressure. Of course, if diaphragm is involved, the whole function, whole vital capacity will be disturbed, because inspiration is the active part of the breathing, and patient loses the strength to inhale. The patient is no longer, able to inhale properly. Why? Because diaphragm is involved. So inspiration is the main inspiratory muscle is diaphragm, and expiration is the elastic recoil of the lung. So for expiration, I don't need any muscle involvement, but for inspiration, I have to have my diaphragm strong. But if diaphragm is weak, then of course the lung capacities and all over volumes you can see deranged. So PFTs will be decreased. Now, how we are going to treat these patients? So you will give them immunoglobulin, of course, against antibodies. We will always give immunoglobulins, and we can also remove those antibodies from the blood with the help of plasmapheresis. Plasmapheresis, what the plasmapheresis is doing, it's actually going to remove those antibodies which are actually acting against on myelin sheath. Okay, so now we'll go for the questions. Here the question is saying a 12-year-old boy present with difficult walking for the last 2 days. So walking is impaired in a 12-year-old boy. He stated that his weakness was preceded by pain in the muscle and tingling sensation. So first he was having pain, and then he was having tingling sensation, and then he actually was having difficulty in walking. Then started down the lower limb but kept ascending upward to the upper limbs. So the history is very suggestive. Ascending history is there. Ascending involvement is there. First, he was saying that the lower limb was having pain and tingling sensation, then difficulty in walking, and slightly the upper limbs are going to involve, and it takes time. And the patient must be giving you a history of ascending weakness, like going from down to up. He gave a history of preceding upper respiratory tract infection 2 weeks before. There was a history of infection in the respiratory muscle as well. Respiratory involvement is there. On examination, he had total areflexia. So deep tendon reflexes are lost. The patient is having no reflexes of both arms and lower limbs with moderate sensory involvement. So it's a very clear presentation where the boy is giving you a history of ascending motor involvement. Like the lower limb muscles are affected first, and then upper limb muscles are affected. The boy is showing you the history of respiratory involvement. The boy is giving you a history of areflexia, or you can check the reflexes in the boy, which is showing here areflexia, like deep tendon reflexes are severely affected, no reflexes at all, although the limbs are full of reflexes. You can see bicep reflex, tricep reflex, quadricep reflex, all the reflexes are lost. It means that that's a clear case of GBS syndrome. It's not a viral myelitis. Epidural abscess had something related to the nervous system that always follow from up to down, never from down to up. Transverse myelitis also, it's a spinal involvement. There is no such spinal involvement, or else if there is a spinal involvement, you can only see the peripheral involvement. There is nothing related to the upper limb. It's only related to the peripheral areas and maybe the areas surrounding the viscera, mostly the involuntary involvement. But GBS is the one which is purely showing you the motor involvement, and that is actually occurring from down to up, the ascending infection. So that's a clear case of GBS. Then we have this one. A 12-year-old girl comes to the clinic after developing progressive weakness and inability to walk. The same presentation, inability to walk, the same presentation like in the previous question before. She has intermittent tingling of her fingers and toes. Same presentation, intermittent tingling of extremities is there. History reveals she had 3 days of diarrhea. 3 days of diarrhea. Once diarrhea is there, Campylobacter jejuni history is there about 2 weeks ago. Physical examination confirms marked peripheral muscle weakness. So peripheral muscles are involved without atrophy or fasciculation. So there is no muscle myotrophy diseases, nothing like that. Only the muscle weakness is there, peripheral muscle weakness. The ankle and patellar reflexes are absent. Ankle and patellar reflexes means that deep tendon reflexes. So deep tendon reflexes are absent. And sensory examination is normal. So it means that nothing related to the brain here. Motor involvement is symmetric, like both of the lower limbs are not working properly. Both of the lower limbs are actually affected. So which of the following is the most likely diagnosis? What do you think? Do you think it's a mononeuritis multiplex? Mononeuritis multiplex, only one nerve is going to involve. Of course, this is not the one nerve. Both of the lower limbs are involved. So of course, it's not going to be a mononeuritis. Myasthenia gravis cannot be occurring in a 12-year-old girl, or maybe if it's occurring, it's an antibody thing. And in order to do that, you have to have some particular history myasthenia gravis, but it usually associated with dementia, and the patient should be old age in order to make a diagnosis of myasthenia gravis. Polio presentation can be same, like the difficulty is there, but usually the polio is starting from up to down. So mostly first thing the child is experiencing, and the child is having polio, the child is no longer able to hold his neck. The neck is actually going down. The holding power of neck is not there. So that's a pure infection, pure thing occurring from up to down. So first must be the neck involvement and then the lower. But here in this child, in this girl, there is no neck involvement. So we cannot go for polio diagnosis. So of course, it's a clear case of GBS based on the presentation, like lower limbs are involved. She's having deep tendon reflexes are lost. She is having tingling sensations in the lower limb, and she was having diarrhea. So there must be some bacterial infection histories, and most likely diarrheal causes in children are Campylobacter jejuni. That's the most common organism. So of course, we always think about GBS.
Excuse me, Dr. Hira?
Yes, doctor.
These infections can lead to GBS?
Which infection? Which one? Come again.
This diarrheal infection and upper respiratory, these organisms can lead to
yes.
damage and all.
Of course, because that's the main pathophysiology. This one of the main agent, that is Campylobacter jejuni. It's a major infection, mostly it's responsible for creating diarrhea, right? That's the most common infection in children. Now, what will happen if Campylobacter jejuni goes in our body? Then what will happen? Our body is going to produce antibodies against that infection. And in GBS, the pathophysiology is this one. The antibodies which is formed against this Campylobacter will of course work on this Campylobacter, but also going to do autoimmune disorder on our peripheral nerves. The myelin sheet of the peripheral nerves actually going to get damaged with those antibodies which are actually formed against this Campylobacter. But what they're doing, they are own antibodies, and they're going to work on the against myelin sheet of these peripheral nerves and then cause GBS. So this is how this organism is actually, play a part. So whatever the antibodies are going to form against Campylobacter or those particularly food poisoning organism, then what will happen? And that antibody is actually going to act on our own peripheral nerves. And why it is all happening? That's autoimmune. Autoimmune means we don't know the reason why our own antibodies are acting our own antigens, but it is happening. So it is happening. That's why it's saying it's a syndrome. It's a disease condition. So our antibodies is not going to work against Campylobacter, but also against going to work against the myelin sheath of our peripheral nerves, and they will do antigen antibody reaction there. Myelin sheath will be destroyed, and once myelin sheath is destroyed, then what will happen? The peripheral nerves will become weaker and weaker and weaker and cause this low motor neuron dysfunction, cause voluntary movement of the lower limb will be lost. You got the point?
Yes, thank you very much. Yes.
Now for the next one, we have to go for the theory first. Then we have this migraine. It's again there in MTB. We'll go and check in MTB. Okay, so actually we have to cover all these three because all these three are very important. But for recall point of view, you can only see the recall of tension headache and migraine. But these all three type of headaches you should know very well, because presentation is very much clear and we should know how to make a diagnosis of this one. So first of all, we have headache that's called tension headache. Always the patient will give you a history of bilateral band-like pressure. He must be saying that I'm having this band-like pain in my forehead. That's a clear presentation. And it lasts for 4 to 6 hours, and when you do the physical examination, there is nothing you can find significant. But patient always give you a history that doctor, I'm always having a headache with just like a band, with just like a straight forehead pain. So that's a band-like pressure, band-like pain on the forehead, and that's a clear cut symptomatic presentation of tension headache. But whenever we say migraine patient must be having plus minus aura. Plus minus aura means that whenever the migraine attack is going to start it, the patient must feel dizzy, weak. There may be vertigo in some of the sometimes the vertigo can happen. The whole surrounding can be spinning, the movement can be disturbed. Sometimes nausea will start, sometimes patient can vomit also. So these symptoms are called aura. Aura means that actual migraine is not there, but symptoms are just started, which pointing you towards that the patient might be thinking, okay, now I'm feeling nausea, maybe I'm going to have this migraine attack. Now I vomit, maybe I can end up in migraine pain. Now I'm feeling vertigo is there, the whole thing is spinning around on my side. It means that now I'm going to have migraine. So these are aura symptoms. Photophobia. The light is going to the patient is going to get fear from the light. Light is going to disturb the patient. Related to maybe some food, emotions, or menstruation. Before the onset of menstruation, also the girls are having this migraine. So sometime there may be arthria, aphasia, dysarthria. Maybe you can see that the patient is no longer to speak properly. Dysarthria is there, or aphasia is there, numbness is there, but that is quite rare in migraine, but it do happen. So think about this one. Whenever the patient is going to have this aura symptoms or the light difficulty, light problems is there. Sometimes during emotions, a certain emotional stress is there, and owing to that, the patient is going to have migraine. So that's an important presentation. In cluster headache, there is episodic pain, like unilateral periorbital intense when only one eye is paining a lot. There is lacrimation of that particular eye. One eye is going to get, the nasal stiffness is there, litosis is there. The one eye particularly is going, the eyelid is going to get down. That is a litosis. So you can see it's episodic pain. And mostly unilateral involvement is there. So whenever it says unilateral involvement, eye redness is there, always think about cluster headache. Whenever it says aura symptoms are there and then the patient is having headache, think about migraine. Whenever it says a band-like headache, you will always think about tension headache. So what we are going to give in all these types of headache, for tension headache, you can give NSAID, you can give acetaminophen. For migraine, we always ask patient to avoid the triggers, whatever the trigger is there. Say, for example, too much light, going from darkness into a bright light or brightness to the dark light, that can always trigger. Or sometimes hot drinks and hot chocolates and hot stuff can also initiate migraine. So we will always counsel the patient, if you have already a history of migraine, just avoid these triggers. Of course, we will give them NSAIDs, and that's the important thing. We will give them triptans. Triptans is going to work on histamine receptors, especially, and they are going to work as agonist. And what they will do? They will just release the vasoconstriction. And once the vasoconstriction is not there, then what will happen? The blood supply will be good enough. So once the blood supply is good enough, there will be no pain. Pain always occurs because of ischemia, because of vasoconstriction. If we can just reverse the vasoconstriction, we can just release the pain. So in cluster headache also, you can give the sumatriptan that is also going to act as agonist. You can give them octreotide. You can supply them oxygen. So via oxygen, because sometimes there is too much nasal stiffness is there, that oxygen saturation drops down. So by giving oxygen, we usually help the patient. So you can give them oxygen also, but sumatriptan also and octreotide. Just remember this one. But NSAIDs is the basic for tension headache, and mostly the questions are related to the treatment part. So we usually give NSAIDs in case of tension headache. We usually give NSAIDs and avoid triggers, and give triptans in migraine. We usually give triptans and oxygen in cluster headaches. Prophylaxis, of course, tension headache, you cannot prevent that, but of course, we can prevent this migraine if 3 attacks per month. If the patient is experiencing 3 attacks per month, we can always ask patient to take propranolol so that vasodilation can occur. Propranolol, the basic mechanism of propranolol is going to dilate the vessel, and so that the frequency of migraine can be reduced. So we can just put a patient on low dose propranolol just in order to maintain the vasodilation all the time in the body, so that there will be no attack of migraine. Or sodium valproate does the same thing, vasodilation. For cluster headache, we can also give them prednisone, verapamil, sodium valproate, but normally we usually don't provide prophylaxis for cluster headache. But if the patient again is having too much attacks of cluster headache, we may consider this prednisone. Prednisone is going to, subside this eye inflammation, lacrimation problem can easily be subsided with the help of this prednisone. And verapamil, sodium valproate again going to cause vasodilation. So we can just give them as a prophylaxis. Prophylaxis means that they are going to prevent the next attack. They cannot help with the existing attack. They're just going to minimize the frequency of the recurrent attacks. So,
excuse me, Dr. Hira,
yes,
sodium valproate is?
Sodium valproate, we usually give them as a vasodilator agonist. They are going to act on this histamine receptors, and by blocking, and once the histamine is released, it's going to act on what? It's going to act on vessels in order to
it's
dilate
anti-epileptic. It's anti-epileptic now.
So in anti-epileptic also we are doing the same mechanism. We want to dilate the vessel. We want the muscles to be relaxed. So the same thing is happening here. But here we are mainly concerned for vessels. We are not actually concerned for nerve conduction of vessels. Like the nerve who is actually going to act on the vessel, that is called vasa nervosa. So in epileptics, actually we are more concerned towards vasa nervosa. Like the vessel who is going to supply, the nerve who is going to supply the vessel. That should not constrict the vessel. That's the main pathophysiology of epilepsy. Right? But here we are not concerned about that one. We are concerned about vasodilation. We only want the brain area to be supplied properly with the vessels. Like blood supply should be good enough so that there will be no headache. Yeah. So the same thing is happening here, but the purpose is only vasodilation. The purpose is not to relax the nerves, and nerves will relax the vessels. So it's other way around. For epilepsy, we will think about the nervosa, vasa nervosa, like the nerves who are actually supplying the vessel of that particular area. So we are very concerned about the nerves. The nerves should not constrict the vessels, so that vessels cannot be constricted and the area should be well supplied. But for headache, we are not bothering about the nerves. We are only bothering about the vessels of that particular area. So those vessels should be dilated. Yes. So prophylaxis question, of course, they are not going to ask you, but you should know the treatment and you should know the symptoms of specific headache. So say, for example, here the question says, a 12-year-old child presents to the clinic with a worsening history of severe headaches that are unilateral. So think about the presentation. This is unilateral and worsening history of severe headache. So headache, who is unilateral, pulsating, exacerbated by movements and aggravated by light. Which of the following most likely type of headache? What do you think? What could it be? It's unilateral, it's exacerbated by movement, aggravated by light, from going from bright light into the dark light, or from dark to bright light. That's a trigger. So you remember what kind of headache was there, which was actually preceded by a trigger, or aura was there? flowing in the which of the following is the most likely diagnosis? So what do you think? Any response?
Migraine.
Yeah, it's mostly migraine. Of course, don't confuse with the unilateral thing, because in cluster also there is a unilateral involvement. But in order to make a diagnosis of cluster headache, there should be redness of the eye, there should be lacrimation, there should be nasal stiffness. But there is nothing related to the light there. There will be no aura, there will be no trigger in the cluster headache. So of course, it's a migraine. Maybe some can think unilateral involvement, and some can go with the cluster one. But remember, for the cluster one, we have to have multiple cluster things, in order to make a diagnosis. Okay, for this one, a 16-year-old boy comes to the clinic complaining of severe headache twice a week. So headache history is twice a week. He described the pain like a tight band around the head with pressure behind the eyes with a throbbing and bursting sensation. So it says tight band around the head. So band-like presentation. So whenever it says band-like presentation, what comes in your mind? Tension headache should come in your mind.
Headache.
Yeah, the patient has been stressed with school, work, and sports. So stress history is there. Which of the following is the most likely diagnosis? So whenever it says tight band or something band-like around the forehead, around the head, on the forehead, always think about tension headache. And he is also worried about the school homework, so you can easily relate. Okay. For the next one, we have to go for the theory first. So take this one. So it's a polio. Again, it's not there in MTB, so I'll take you to emboss. Okay. So the disease is actually poliomyelitis and polio. And of course, it's caused by the polio virus, one of the enterovirus that is going to cause this poliomyelitis and polio. Here we will see the polio virus is spread via fecal oral transmission. So, the unhygienic condition can cause this one. Although the majority of poliovirus infection are asymptomatic, some may invade the CNS. So they can go in the brain, leading to motor neuron death and irreversible paralysis that can cause respiratory insufficiency and death. So of course, whenever there is brain involvement, so think about when the brain is involved, the whole muscle paralysis all over the body, the muscle paralysis can be there. And the main clinical features of poliomyelitis are weakness, decreased muscle tone, and hyperreflexia. But that is not going from down to up. It's always going from up to down. So that's why whenever the child who's going to present with you with the symptoms of infection and he is unable to hold his neck, always think about this polio one. The diagnosis is established based on polymerase chain reaction. Of course, it's a viral infection. It's a poliovirus, it's enterovirus. So we have to go for PCR testing in order to make a final diagnosis. Poliomyelitis has been eradicated. Of course, in almost all of the countries it has gone. But mostly in Pakistan and Afghanistan, we can still see the cases of poliomyelitis. But overall, worldwide, it's now no more. The treatment of poliomyelitis is mainly supportive. Patient with brainstem or respiratory muscle involvement may require intubation and mechanical ventilation. Of course, whenever too much respiratory involvement is there, that is lethal to life, we can go for mechanical ventilation. The majority of patients do not regain their full strength after recovery. Some patients go on to develop post-polio syndrome, a poorly understood syndrome characterized by progressive disability and muscle weakness decade after the initial polio infection. Maybe the polio infection occurring soon after birth, but it will remain, the effects will remain throughout the life. That is called polio, post-polio syndrome. Even only the one episode of polio is good enough for the whole life of the baby to get, help. So here we will see what are the clinical features here. So maybe if CNS involvement is there, we can say poliomyelitis without CNS involvement. If there is no CNS involvement, or if there is CNS involvement, we can say the CNS involvement. So of course, if there is no CNS involvement, then other organs will be involved. Say, most likely GI will be involved. If GI is involved, it can cause gastroenteritis, fever, sore throat can be there, migraine, headaches can be there. So if the child is presenting to you and he is having sore throat, fever, nausea, myalgia, headaches, gastroenteritis, also you can think about this poliomyelitis. It's not like that always the boy is presenting with muscle paralysis, then only you will make a diagnosis of polio. No, if there is sore throat, myalgia, headaches, fever, gastroenteritis thing, you can say these are also the symptoms in which there is no CNS involvement. And of course, if the boy is presenting with these things, this one can recovered, fully recovered, of course. So complete recovery can be occurred without complication. But if once CNS is involved, then of course we will have some big problems. Like begin several days following abortive poliomyelitis, often temporary. Fever, neck stiffness, headache, vomiting can be there. In non-paralytic, of course, paralysis will not be the feature, and paralytic poliomyelitis, paralysis will be there. So neck muscle weakness, head drop sign. Head falls back when placed in a supine position. So usually poliomyelitis without CNS symptoms can present with non-paralytic poliomyelitis. Like the child can be having sore throat, myalgia, and child can be having this head falls back when placed in a supine position. So that these two symptoms can also go together. Then also you will make a diagnosis of polio. But the only thing is here the CNS is not much involved, that it cannot lead to paralysis, but still the weakness is there. So mostly, they are giving you the symptoms of this without CNS involvement, but they can also give you the symptoms of non-paralytic poliomyelitis. Here, the most likely symptom is head drop sign. So whenever head drop sign is there, we should always think about polio. The paralytic poliomyelitis, of course, the term paralysis is there. So it can present with fever, malaise, headache, severe back, neck, and muscle pain. And you can see flaccid paralysis here in over hours to days. Maybe within hours or maybe within days, the boy or the child can develop flaccid paralysis. Of course, respiratory failure will be there, and you have to keep that child on mechanical ventilation. So how we are going to diagnose these one? Of course, PCR, we have already done this one. That's the most important thing for detecting viral infection. And how we are going to treat this patient? We can just go for the symptomatic treatment. If the pain is there, we have to go for the pain relief, mechanical ventilation. If respiratory involvement is there and respiratory muscle paralysis is there, of course, we have no choice rather than mechanical ventilation and close monitoring, of course, supportive therapy. So now let's have a look at the question. Here the question says, a 9-year-old boy who presents to the emergency department with fever, headache, sore throat, and vomiting. So fever, headache, sore throat, vomiting will not give you a clear clue until and unless you read the next part of the question, because that's a general thing. Headache, sore throat can occur in pharyngitis also. Now, he recently arrived from Africa. So when it says Africa, you will think about low socio-economic status. With his parents on examination, he shows abnormal reflexes, stiff neck, and difficulty in lifting his head and legs when he was lying flat on his back. So what is the clear sign here? Difficulty in lifting his head. So this head up phenomena is very much peculiar for polio thing. So he's presenting with the symptoms. He's presenting with the symptoms without CNS involvement, and he is having this sign, which is very important here: difficulty in lifting his head and legs when he was flying flat on his back. His lab investigation shows clear CSF. Clear CSF with lymphocytosis. So lymphocytosis is there. It means that some viral infection. Of course, enterovirus history is there. That's why he's having sore throat, and polio virus is enterovirus. So we will see lymphocyte count will be increased, normal glucose level and normal protein. So whenever the protein is normal, glucose is normal, you always think about viral infection. If there is neutrophil bacterial infection, you will see high predominance neutrophils and you will see high proteins level. Now, which of the following is the most likely organism? So based on the presentation of viral infection in the CSF, based on the presentation of this lifting his head and legs while lying flat, unable to lift his head, this one, based on the presentation of headache, sore throat, and vomiting, and based on the area involvement, low socioeconomic status, you can always think of poliovirus. So which of the following is the most likely organism responsible? So he is having poliomyelitis infection, which is caused by poliovirus. Of course, not a cytomegalovirus. For cytomegalovirus, the presentation must be diarrhea and all that, motor neuron involvement and diarrhea, which is not here. Coronavirus, of course, you can relate with this one. There is no history of I have just mentioned coronavirus here, but of course you will not find, if there is a recent recall pool, recent MCQ bank pool, then only you can find coronavirus, otherwise not. Epstein-Barr virus, EBV virus, again for EBV virus, there must be a presentation related, and it for diagnostic point of view, symptoms also, lab investigation also, but this is clearly a clinical diagnosis based on the presentation. So that's all for today. Thank you, everyone. Thank you so much.
Dr. Hira, what will be the presentation for EBV?
See, mostly the Epstein-Barr virus infection usually present with respiratory infection. So you will find respiratory infection, but you will also find motor deficit, motor neuronal deficit in those one. There will be a prolonged history of diarrhea, prolonged, motor neuronal involvement. Then only you can say. And but in order to make a diagnosis of Epstein-Barr virus, you have to have a clear Epstein-Barr virus history of you have to go for the lab investigations. Otherwise, you cannot say it's Epstein-Barr virus infection. And mostly it's a congenital one. So maybe, in early stages, you will see this Epstein-Barr virus infection.
Okay, okay.
Yeah.
Thank you. Thank you.
Okay. Thank you, dear. Thank you, everyone. See you tomorrow. Bye.
Thank you.